Autumn 1918. The Great War was collapsing into its bloody silence. Yet a young Italian prince did not fall to shrapnel or bullets, but to an invisible enemy. At just 29, Prince Umberto of Savoy died in a military camp in Veneto, carried off by the Spanish flu. How could a man born beneath palace ceilings, guarded by privilege, vanish like the nameless soldiers around him, reduced to one more forgotten body in a world drowning in grief? In the grand narrative of the House of Savoy, Prince Umberto was a name that rarely commanded the spotlight. Born on June 15, 1889, in the city of Turin, he entered the world not as an heir, but as a shadow, destined always to stand slightly behind the throne. His father, Victor Emmanuel III, would go on to reign for nearly half a century, guiding Italy through wars, alliances, and eventual downfall. His elder brother carried the title of Crown Prince, the weight of dynastic continuity placed firmly upon his shoulders. And Umberto? He was the second son, the spare, a figure both essential and expendable in the mechanics of monarchy. From the moment he opened his eyes beneath the frescoed ceilings of the royal palace, Umberto's fate was shaped by contrast. Where the firstborn was a flame, carefully sheltered to ensure it would not go out, Umberto was the flicker on the periphery, useful if needed, forgotten if not. The court chroniclers wrote far less about him. His face appeared in photographs, standing stiff in military uniforms, but his name seldom drew headlines. Even in youth, he was learning the peculiar lesson of being visible, yet invisible. Recognized, but not remembered. In many ways, this shadowed existence was liberating. He was not bound to the suffocating expectations that chained his brother. He would not be forced to memorize the intricacies of constitutional law, to bear the crushing anticipation of ruling a restless nation. Instead, his destiny pointed elsewhere, into the discipline of the barracks, the roar of parades, the life of a soldier prince. For Umberto, honor would be carved not with a crown, but with a sword. Italy, at the time of his childhood, was itself a nation uncertain of its identity. Recently unified, still divided between North and South, the country carried within it the fragility of something young and untested. And so too did Umberto. He grew up in an atmosphere of both grandeur and instability. Palaces filled with marble staircases, yet surrounded by a country racked with poverty and unrest. His own identity reflected this contradiction, dressed in silk, but destined to march in mud. Accounts of his youth reveal little in the way of romance or intrigue. Unlike some princes whose lives overflowed with scandal, Umberto left almost no footprint in gossip or rumor. Silence, in many ways, was his companion. It was not that he lacked vitality, but that history had already chosen to glance past him. He became the kind of figure who is always present in photographs, yet absent from memory. A reminder that even within royal families, some lives are penciled in faint lines, while others are carved in bold strokes. And yet, there was dignity in his obscurity. In court ceremonies, he stood erect beside his brother, never pushing forward, never retreating. Observers noted his seriousness, his discipline, his willingness to accept a role that was neither central nor meaningless. Like a soldier awaiting orders, he embodied readiness without demand. It was as though his entire existence was rehearsal, practice for a destiny that might never arrive. This condition, being essential but secondary, shaped his worldview. When the opportunity came to serve Italy not in court but on the battlefield, Umberto did not hesitate. He had been waiting all his life to step into a role that, while not the throne, would still allow him to matter. For a prince overlooked in politics, war offered a stage where courage, not birth order, would define legacy. And so the young prince moved further from palace corridors and deeper into the sound of drums and rifles. His life, marked by shadows, was preparing to intersect with an even greater darkness, the one that would engulf Europe in 1914. In that shadow, Umberto would find both his moment of presence and the beginning of his erasure. Like a star dimmed by the light of a larger one, he was destined to shine only in the peripheries. And yet, in those peripheries, tragedy often waits. If the palace had trained his brother to wear a crown, it trained Umberto to wear the uniform. From the earliest days of his boyhood, discipline replaced indulgence, and steel replaced silk. He was not coddled with the comforts of intellectual salons or political theory. Instead, he was handed the weight of rifles, the stiffness of marching drills, and the austere life of barracks. The House of Savoy had long been a dynasty that carved its reputation on the battlefield. For centuries, its princes were measured not only by diplomacy, but by the willingness to bleed for their flag. Umberto's education followed that tradition with near military severity. At an age when other children of privilege were still learning poetry or mastering piano keys, he was taught to ride in formation, to salute without hesitation, to endure cold winds on parade grounds without flinching. Instructors spoke less of governance and more of obedience. The state is protected by the sword, one officer drilled into him, and the prince must be the first to carry it. The words settled into him like iron filings into a magnet. He did not rebel, nor did he sigh. He absorbed the lessons quietly, as if his very identity was being soldered together piece by piece like armor. It was a lonely education. While his elder brother was surrounded by tutors on law, economics, and diplomacy, Umberto's company was the hardness of sergeants and the echo of boots on stone. Yet in this solitude, something resolute grew. He developed a stoicism that would later make him endure not only the chaos of artillery fire, but also the invisible cruelty of disease. To him, hardship was not an exception. It was the expected condition of life. His letters from adolescence, few though they are, reveal little of romantic flourish or youthful rebellion. Instead, they describe maneuvers, inspections, the rigid structure of training schedules. One might even call them colorless. Yet, in that very absence of ornament lies the essence of Umberto. He did not live in metaphors, nor did he seek glory in words. His existence was practical, forged by routine, like a sword sharpened each day until it gleamed with purpose. But beneath this martial exterior, there was also a gentleness that sometimes flickered through. Accounts from officers noted that Umberto treated subordinates with respect unusual for his rank. He did not bark orders simply to enjoy obedience. Rather, he carried himself with an understated gravity, as if he knew he was being prepared for a war greater than himself. His education did not merely shape a soldier, it shaped a man who could stand among other men without demanding privilege. Italy, at the dawn of the 20th century, was simmering with contradictions, ambitious in empire, yet fractured in identity. For the young prince, this paradox mirrored his own life. He was royal, yet peripheral, privileged, yet subjected to harsher discipline than many common recruits. His very training carried the message that bloodlines could elevate him to a barracks faster than to a throne. By the time he reached his late teens, Umberto was already molded into the image of the Savoy soldier. Erect posture, sharp salute, silent endurance. His education had done its work. He was less a prince of pageantry than a blade waiting to be unsheathed. What he could not foresee was that the war awaiting him would not only test his courage, but strip away the illusion that soldiers and princes belonged to separate worlds. On the front lines of the Alps, frostbite and fear would erase distinctions. In the mud, the son of a king would stand shoulder to shoulder with the son of a farmer. And in that equality of suffering, Umberto would find the only stage history allowed him, the battlefield, where every man was equal under the same cold sky. In 1914, when the world tilted into chaos, Umberto was 25. He had grown into the rigid frame of a soldier prince, carrying himself with a seriousness that seemed older than his years. The drums of war that echoed across Europe did not spare Italy, and by 1915, the kingdom was drawn into the cataclysm, its banners unfurled against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For Umberto, this was no abstract quarrel of nations. It was the summons his entire education had prepared him to answer. The front he entered was not one of gallant cavalry charges or ceremonial parades. It was the northern frontier, where the Alps loomed like indifferent giants, their peaks wrapped in snow and silence. Here, the war was not fought across rolling plains, but along ridges and cliffs, where soldiers clung to frozen ground like shadows etched into the mountain. The battlefield was less a landscape than a labyrinth of cold, a place where nature itself seemed to conspire with artillery to crush human endurance. Umberto did not receive the privilege of distant command posts. He was often seen in the trenches, his boots sunk in mud, his cloak dusted with snow. To many, it was astonishing. A prince of Italy, standing in the same icy winds that froze the hands of common soldiers. There was no velvet in those dugouts, no marble floors, only damp earth, the sour smell of gunpowder, and the ceaseless percussion of shells. The war on the Italian front was uniquely brutal. Men fought not only against enemy fire, but against avalanches, frostbite, and hunger. Entire battalions could vanish overnight, swallowed by snowstorms or crushed beneath collapsing ice. Soldiers joked bitterly that the mountains killed more swiftly than the Austrians. For Umberto, these trials became a daily litany, each one chiseling deeper into his understanding of mortality. Reports from comrades describe him as calm, composed, even approachable. He ate the same rations, endured the same sleepless nights, and spoke little of his rank. His presence offered a strange form of comfort. If even a prince could suffer alongside them, then perhaps their suffering carried a dignity beyond survival. He became less a distant figure of monarchy and more a mirror of their own humanity. Yet, as months bled into years, the shadow of war grew heavier. The mountains echoed not only with artillery, but with despair. Letters from the front describe endless funerals, crosses planted so thickly they seemed to sprout from the ground like a new kind of forest. For every valley conquered, another was lost. The war was a pendulum, swinging back and forth, cutting lives with each arc. In this bleak theater, Umberto's role was not that of a strategist reshaping borders, but of a man caught in the machinery of destruction. He was no different from the millions of others who had traded their youth for uniforms. What made him distinct was not his survival, but the fact that history would later reduce his name to a footnote. Even here, in the thick of battle, his presence was recorded only briefly, like a candle flickering against the storm. The war demanded everything and gave nothing back. Glory turned to mud, honor to exhaustion, and hope to silence. The Alps swallowed the sounds of men as efficiently as they swallowed their bodies. And in this silence, Umberto began to disappear, not in death yet, but in the gradual erasure that comes when an individual becomes indistinguishable from the multitude. For a prince born in shadows, the war was not merely an ordeal. It was a second burial. A life already half forgotten, now folded into the anonymity of soldiers dying unnamed. He had sought to find significance in battle. But instead, the war itself was erasing significance. The shadow he had lived under since birth was merging with a greater darkness of Europe's catastrophe. And within that vast shadow, something worse than bullets was already moving. An invisible enemy, waiting for its hour. The image of a prince usually conjures visions of gilded halls, processions in carriages, and banquets under chandeliers. But for Prince Umberto of Savoy, the backdrop of his adulthood was entirely different. The mud-soaked trenches of northern Italy. Here the stage was not marble, but earth, not lighted by chandeliers, but by flares arching across the night sky. What startled many of his comrades was not merely that a royal had come to the front. It was how willingly he abandoned the distance of privilege. He did not retreat to warm headquarters or insist upon insulated comfort. Instead, he spent long nights among soldiers, wrapped in the same woolen blankets, shivering under the same indifferent stars. To them, he was less a distant symbol of monarchy and more a fellow sufferer, enduring the same relentless hunger, the same gnawing cold. In the diaries of soldiers, his presence was often noted with quiet admiration. "He eats what we eat," one infantryman scribbled. "Black bread, watery soup, and sometimes nothing at all. He does not ask for more. He sits with us in silence." That silence was not empty. In a world where screams of shells and cries of the wounded filled every hour, silence itself became an act of solidarity. Umberto's refusal to separate himself from the men was a way of saying, "I am not above you. I fall with you if we fall." This closeness, however, came with peril. In the trenches, proximity was a double-edged sword. To stand shoulder to shoulder with ordinary soldiers was to inherit not only their respect, but also their vulnerabilities. Disease spread through the dugouts faster than any rumor. Lice gnawed at the skin, rats feasted in the dark, and the air itself felt heavy with infection. Privilege could shield a man from politics, but it could not shield him from the damp cough of the man sleeping beside him. Still, Umberto embraced the life of a soldier with almost stubborn conviction. He inspected weapons, trudged through snowdrifts, and visited field hospitals where the smell of disinfectant clashed with the stench of wounds. In those wards, his princely bearing meant little. Bandaged men groaned without looking up, some too delirious to recognize who stood near them. Yet for Umberto, the anonymity of these encounters was strangely liberating. He was not addressed as "Your Highness." He was just another figure moving through corridors of suffering. In the evenings, when the front quieted for brief hours, Umberto sometimes joined the men as they told stories by the dim glow of lanterns. These were not tales of glory, but of home. The vineyard left untended, the children waiting without bread, the mothers praying in silence. Listening, Umberto was reminded that his palace in Turin was not the only home tied to this war. His family's grief, should he fall, would be one grief among millions. The realization cut through the veil of royalty and revealed the stark equality of sorrow. The symbolism of a prince among soldiers was not lost on propaganda offices in Rome. Newspapers occasionally carried brief mentions, hailing his courage as proof of royal solidarity with the troops. Yet those articles were thin, fleeting, quickly buried beneath columns of casualty lists. His presence was too quiet, too humble to fuel the great machinery of myth. He was not flamboyant like some generals, not boastful in dispatches. He was, as always, a shadow, visible but not luminous enough to dominate the page. And yet within the trenches, that shadow meant everything. Soldiers spoke of him as one of their own, though they knew his blood carried centuries of dynasty. His humility was a contrast to the arrogance of some officers. And in that contrast, he earned respect not demanded, but given freely. To men accustomed to being treated as expendable, the sight of a prince enduring the same hardships was a strange and quiet comfort. But comfort could not stop the relentless erosion of bodies and spirits. As the war dragged on, the soldiers' faces grew hollow, their eyes older than their years. Death was not a single event, but a constant presence, a companion who lay down in every trench. And Umberto, by sharing their world, also shared their peril. He might have been safer behind palace walls, yet he chose to remain in the mire. In doing so, he crossed an invisible threshold, from royal figure to mortal man, indistinguishable from the thousands around him. There is a cruel irony in this choice. By seeking nearness, he opened himself to the same fate as the nameless infantrymen. By rejecting distance, he embraced vulnerability. The war did not reward such gestures. It only consumed them. His very humanity, the quality that earned him the affection of soldiers, would later become the pathway through which death reached him. It is here that the story of Prince Umberto gains its tragic weight. For his brother, history reserved a throne. For him, history reserved a trench. And within that trench, the invisible enemy that would claim his life was already circulating, passed in a cough, carried in the damp breath of comrades, waiting patiently for its royal prey. The soldiers who wrote about him would later struggle to remember dates or battles. But they remembered the image, a young man of noble blood, sitting on a wooden crate in the mud, his cloak wrapped tightly, listening more than speaking. To them, he was not simply a prince. He was proof that even those born into marble could choose to stand in the dirt. And that choice, noble though it was, would cost him the only thing he truly possessed: his fragile, unrecorded life. The autumn of 1918 carried more than the smell of cordite and damp earth. It carried something weightless, unseen, yet infinitely more lethal than artillery. The Spanish flu, as the newspapers would later call it, moved across Europe like a tide of shadows, unstoppable, indifferent, and merciless. Soldiers feared bullets they could see. They feared the enemy's guns that thundered from mountain ridges. But what they could not see, they could not fight. At first, it announced itself in whispers. A soldier coughing in the dark, a medic noticing fevers that spread faster than wounds could heal. Unlike the shells that fell in arcs of fire, this enemy arrived quietly, like a draft of cold air slipping through a crack. Within weeks, the whispers became groans, the groans became funerals. Camps that had endured years of bombardment began to collapse under the pressure of sickness. Men who had survived avalanches and machine guns were felled in days by a virus smaller than dust. For the armies, it was as if death had multiplied itself. The trenches were no longer just battlegrounds against Austria-Hungary, but breeding grounds for contagion. Mud became a cradle of infection. Lice carried fevers from man to man. The very air grew thick with invisible daggers. In dugouts, soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder, their breaths mingling, carrying unseen messengers of mortality. Prince Umberto, living among them, was no exception. His choice to share their rations, their spaces, their very air, so admired by the men, also meant he shared their risks. Privilege could command fresh uniforms and better boots, but it could not command immunity. The virus moved without respect for birth or title. It saw no crown, no dynasty. It entered lungs indiscriminately, burning through bodies like fire through dry grass. The timing was cruel. By October, The war was stumbling toward its exhausted end. Armistice was weeks away. Soldiers who had survived 4 years of carnage suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that offered no glory, no medals, no possibility of defense. A bullet could be dodged, a cough could not. Accounts from Veneto describe wards overflowing, soldiers packed into improvised infirmaries where straw mats were stained with sweat and fever. Doctors moved helplessly from bed to bed, their instruments useless against a sickness they barely understood. The treatments of the time, mustard poultices, quinine, even whiskey, were like paper shields against a flood. Medicine could soothe, but not save. For Umberto, the invisible enemy represented a profound betrayal. He had trained his entire life to face danger with discipline. His education had prepared him to withstand hardship, to command men, even to face death in battle. But what weapon could he raise against an illness that slipped silently into his chest? His soldier's discipline was useless here. Courage could steady his gaze, but it could not clear his lungs. For once, endurance itself became meaningless. The soldiers noticed. Even the prince coughs now, one diary records. There was no satisfaction in the observation, only dread. If sickness could pierce royal blood, what hope did common veins hold? In Umberto's suffering, the men recognized their own. His fevered nights mirrored theirs. His weakness was their weakness, written in flesh that no title could protect. The symbolism was devastating. A royal figure, raised in marble halls, was brought low in the same straw beds as farm boys and factory workers. The disease did what politics and armies could not. It leveled hierarchy. In the cruel equality of contagion, palaces and huts stood side by side. The pandemic was democracy in its most merciless form. Writers would later describe the Spanish flu as a war within a war, a second front that claimed more lives than the artillery of empires. It consumed the strong and the weak alike, erasing distinctions that had defined society for centuries. And in this storm of invisible fire, Prince Umberto of Savoy became less a royal name than a fragile human body, indistinguishable from those around him. What must have haunted him in those weeks was the irony of timing. Victory for Italy was within reach. The empire that had stood against his nation was crumbling. Soldiers could almost taste the silence of peace. Yet peace would not come for him. His war was already ending, not in parades, but in fevered breaths. The enemy that finally struck him was not across the border, but inside his lungs. To those who watched, his decline was swift. A man once trained to ride in formation now struggled to sit upright. A voice that once commanded salutes now rasped in whispers. The prince who had walked proudly among soldiers was becoming indistinguishable from the dying who surrounded him. And yet, perhaps it was in this indistinguishability that his humanity was most complete. Stripped of titles, stripped of privilege, he became what all men are at the edge of death. Frail, mortal, waiting. In that moment, the invisible enemy revealed the final truth of Umberto's existence. That the shadow he had lived under since birth was not just political obscurity, but the shadow of mortality itself. The war had given him comradeship in mud, dignity in humility. The flu gave him only silence, but within that silence lay a lesson sharper than any blade. No dynasty, however old, can bargain with the unseen. The October air in Veneto carried the chill of autumn, but within the military infirmaries, the heat was suffocating. Fever radiated from bodies stacked on straw mats, steam rising like the breath of a furnace. The war outside had quieted into a strange expectancy. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was faltering, armistice whispers filling the camps. Yet inside those makeshift hospitals, another kind of battle raged, silent and unrelenting. Prince Umberto lay among them. The man who had marched beside soldiers, who had endured mud and avalanches, was now confined to a cot. His body, once rigid with discipline, trembled under blankets soaked in sweat. Coughs racked him until his frame seemed to break, each spasm a cruel percussion marking the hours. His lungs, meant to carry commands across icy ridges, now betrayed him with every shallow gasp. The doctors who hovered at his bedside were men of skill, but skill was powerless. Medicine in 1918 was a collection of guesses wrapped in ritual. They tried to cool his fever with cloths, offered concoctions of quinine, applied mustard poultices to his chest. Some whispered prayers, others adjusted bandages. Yet none of it mattered. The influenza moved faster than their hands, its course relentless, unstoppable. Outside the infirmary, soldiers lined up not for battle but for treatment. The wards overflowed, so corridors became dormitories of the dying. The smell was overwhelming. Sweat, sickness, disinfectant, and the faint iron tang of blood. The moans of the fevered mixed with the cries of men who still believed they might return to their families. In this atmosphere, Umberto's royal blood provided no insulation. He was one body among hundreds, waiting for either recovery or death. Those who caught glimpses of him during those days spoke of his eyes, fever bright, yet still carrying a trace of the composure that had marked his character. He did not rage. He did not curse fate. He endured as he had been trained to endure, though his endurance now led only toward silence. A fellow officer later wrote, "He bore it like a soldier, though the battle was unwinnable." What must have struck Umberto most was the reversal of roles. All his life, he had been prepared to meet death in combat, to risk his life for comrades, to stand as a visible figure of courage. Instead, he lay still while others fought around him, powerless. His body the battlefield. His weapon was no longer the rifle, but breath itself, drawn with increasing effort, slipping away like sand through fingers. The irony deepened with each passing day. The world beyond the infirmary was shifting rapidly. Austria-Hungary was unraveling, its armies retreating, its empire collapsing into fragments. Italy was poised for victory. Had Umberto lived a few more weeks, he might have witnessed the end of the war he had given his youth to. But time was no ally. Each hour his fever rose higher, each night his strength ebbed further. The victory of nations was slipping from his grasp, even as death tightened its hold. Witnesses remembered the silence that fell around his cot. In rooms filled with cries, the absence of sound became its own signal. His companions respected it, sensing that this was not simply another soldier dying, but a prince, yet one who died as they did. A strange democracy of suffering reigned in that ward. Titles dissolved, uniforms blurred into the same sweat-stained fabric. Fever recognized no hierarchy. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Here lay a man born in palaces, now reduced to the same fragility as peasants' sons. The flu had become the great equalizer, mocking the illusion that lineage could command survival. In those fevered nights, Umberto's story transformed. From a prince overshadowed by politics into a man illuminated by the truth of mortality. As his condition worsened, small details etched themselves into memory. A rosary slipped between his fingers. A crucifix hung near his bed, its shadow cast long by candlelight. Nurses tried to soothe him, but exhaustion made words unnecessary. His breath rasped in rhythm with the coughing around him, a chorus of decline. Outside, the autumn wind rattled against the infirmary walls, as if nature itself echoed the fragility within. For the men who survived, the memory of those days lingered long after armistice bells rang. They remembered the prince not as a distant figure of ceremony, but as one of them, sick, fevered, waiting for an end. The war had blurred the lines between noble and commoner, but the flu erased them completely. Death looked upon all with the same indifference. By mid-October, it was clear that he would not recover. His chest heaved with the effort of each breath, his face pale beneath the fever's flush. Some accounts suggest he murmured the names of family members. Others recall only silence. What mattered was not the words spoken, but the fact that even a Prince of Savoy, whose blood carried centuries of power, was now indistinguishable from the countless others slipping away in that same ward. The irony of his fate was bitter. History had prepared him to live in shadows, overshadowed by his elder brother, overlooked by chronicles. In death, he was granted no exception. He would vanish not with ceremony, but with coughs, not in parades, but in obscurity. His name would fade into the endless lists of the fallen, his story remembered only faintly, if at all. Yet, in that fading, there was also meaning. For in those final days in Veneto, Umberto embodied the shared fate of humanity. That no palace, no dynasty, no rank can shield against the invisible. His life, lived in the margins, ended in the center of the world's greatest catastrophe. Not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of endurance. The candles burned low in the infirmary. Outside, the war thundered toward its conclusion. Inside, a prince's breaths grew fewer, lighter, until they dissolved into silence. And so, in the autumn of 1918, Prince Umberto of Savoy's life drew to its close, not on the battlefield, but in the shadowed ward of a camp where the invisible enemy triumphed over kings and soldiers alike. The morning of October 19, 1918, broke pale over Veneto. Outside the camp, the sky was heavy with autumn mist, a silence too deep for a land accustomed to cannon fire. The front was collapsing, Austria's armies were retreating, and victory was close enough for soldiers to taste in the air. Yet inside the infirmary, Prince Umberto of Savoy lay on a narrow cot, his battle already decided. He was 29 years old, an age when most men of his station might have been preparing for marriage, for diplomacy, for the slow climb toward influence. Instead, he was preparing for death. The fever had burned through him, leaving his body hollow, his strength a memory. Every breath rattled as if drawn through broken glass. His hands trembled when he tried to grasp the blanket. His lips, once firm in command, now moved only in whispered fragments. Those who attended him later described the room as unbearably still. Soldiers groaned around him, nurses rushed from bed to bed. Yet, at Umberto's side, time seemed to thicken. The flicker of candles painted shadows across the crucifix on the wall, as if even light struggled to remain steady. In that fragile space, a prince lay dying, not with trumpets, but with coughs. What haunted observers was the ordinariness of his end. There was no charge into gunfire, no heroic duel, no dramatic last words shouted across a battlefield. Instead, Umberto's death unfolded like countless others in that year of sickness. Fever rising, lungs drowning, life receding in small increments. It was the death of millions, and therein lay the tragedy, that a man born to distinction met the most indistinct of fates. For the dynasty of Savoy, it was unthinkable. Their sons were raised to carry banners into war, to be remembered in monuments, to inscribe their names into history books. Yet here, one of their princes slipped away in obscurity, his body weakened not by steel, but by something smaller than dust. The contrast was cruel. A lifetime of martial preparation ended not with a sword in hand, but with a damp cloth pressed against his brow. The moment of passing was remembered in fragments. Some say he murmured prayers, lips forming words too faint to hear. Others claim his silence was total, broken only by the rasp of his final breaths. A nurse later recalled the stillness after his chest fell for the last time. It was as though the room itself exhaled, and then did not breathe again. The war outside raged on, but in that cot, a prince had vanished into history's silence. Death at 29 carries its own sharp sting. He had not lived long enough to carve a legacy, nor short enough to be remembered as a prodigy stolen by fate. Instead, he belonged to that liminal space of unrealized potential. A man shaped for duty, cut down before he could leave an imprint. His life was a sketch, never inked, left half-finished on history's page. For the soldiers who survived him, his end was both sorrow and mirror. They had admired his willingness to live as they did, to share their bread and their mud. Now they saw him die as they might. His death confirmed a truth they already knew but could scarcely articulate. In the face of the invisible enemy, all ranks collapsed. A prince's lungs succumbed as easily as a farmer's. Fever did not pause for lineage. The symbolism was stark. While nations fought to preserve boundaries and crowns, the flu ignored them all, slipping past trenches, past palace gates, past borders. It was the one invader that could not be repelled. And in its advance, it erased Umberto as casually as it erased millions of nameless men and women. His royal title was no shield, his military discipline no defense. In retrospect, his death seemed almost scripted by irony. All his life, Umberto had lived in shadow, overshadowed by his elder brother, overlooked by history, destined for a supporting role. When the final curtain fell, it was not a blaze of glory that illuminated him, but the dim, indifferent light of an epidemic. He was not remembered as a war hero or as a statesman. He was remembered, if at all, as a prince who died of influenza at 29. Yet within that ordinariness lay a deeper tragedy. His death revealed the limits of human ambition in the face of mortality. Here was a man born into one of Europe's oldest dynasties, trained to command armies, yet undone by a cough. The irony was unbearable, and yet profoundly human. He became not a symbol of power, but of fragility. Outside, bells began to toll in villages, announcing mass funerals for soldiers lost not in combat, but in fever. Families wept over telegrams that carried no honor, only blunt fact. Died of influenza. Among those countless notices, one bore the name of a prince. But history, already drowning in statistics of loss, barely paused to notice. Umberto's death at 29 was, in its quiet way, a reflection of the war itself. Vast sacrifice yielding little meaning, promises of glory collapsing into mud and silence. The Great War had promised honor. The flu delivered anonymity. And so, in a ward in Veneto, the fate of a prince converged with that of millions, united not by lineage, but by vulnerability. The body of Prince Umberto was carried out quietly. No procession, no fanfare, just another form wrapped and borne away. He left the world as he had lived within it, in shadow, half seen, easily forgotten. News travels strangely in wartime. Victories are shouted from rooftops, defeats whispered in corridors, and private losses often arrive as rumors before they are confirmed. When word reached the royal palace that Prince Umberto had died in Veneto, the message arrived not as a triumphant dispatch, but as a blunt telegram. Died of influenza, 19th October 1918. In a court accustomed to processions and proclamations, the starkness of those words was unbearable. There was no battlefield heroism to soften the grief, no tale of valor to console the dynasty. Just a disease, invisible and merciless, that had claimed a son of the king as easily as it claimed any conscript. King Victor Emmanuel III, known for his stoicism and small stature, was said to have been shaken. This was not the loss of an heir, not the shattering of succession, but the death of a second son. A prince who stood quietly behind the throne, rarely commanding attention, and perhaps that made the grief sharper. For a man whose life had been lived in shadow, his death seemed to vanish into silence almost too easily. The queen, Elena of Montenegro, felt the blow in a different way. Mothers rarely measure the hierarchy of sons. To her, Umberto was not the spare or the shadow, but the boy she had once cradled in Turin, the child who had marched too stiffly in parades, the young man whose eyes had held a trace of gentleness even beneath military discipline. For her, the telegram was not merely history, but heartbreak. The court mourned in rituals. Black drapery hung across palace windows. Masses were said in Turin, Rome, and Naples. Officials stood in silence, their uniforms bright with medals that suddenly felt hollow. Yet even in mourning, there was unease. How could the death of a prince be spoken of with grandeur when the cause was so ordinary? Influenza was not a noble enemy. It did not inspire statues or battle hymns. To die of fever seemed almost humiliating in a dynasty forged by steel. This discomfort echoed through the court like an unspoken confession. Princes were supposed to embody resilience, to fall in combat if they must. Yet here was Umberto, carried away by an illness that spared no one. The nobility of his life, his willingness to live among soldiers, was overshadowed by the banality of his death. The courtiers struggled to reconcile their grief with the narrative expected of monarchy. Still, in quieter corners of the palace, sorrow was more honest. Servants recalled his modesty, the way he addressed them politely, the absence of arrogance. Guards remembered him walking alone in the gardens, thoughtful, almost withdrawn. To them, his death was not an embarrassment, but a reminder that even the highborn were human. His absence was felt not in chronicles, but in empty spaces. An unused chair at the royal table, a voice no longer heard in evening corridors. For the dynasty of Savoy, the loss was symbolic as well as personal. They were a house that had unified Italy, that had fought for its place among Europe's monarchies. Yet, here was proof that their blood offered no immunity against the forces tearing through the continent. If a prince could die as a common soldier did, what distinguished crown from crowd? The line between ruler and subject blurred, not through politics, but through illness. The timing deepened the wound. Italy was on the brink of victory. The war that had consumed 4 years and countless lives was about to end. Other nations would celebrate their heroes, crown their martyrs. And yet, at that very moment of triumph, the Savoy court received only silence and sorrow. Their son had not died in the blaze of glory, but in a fevered bed, anonymous among thousands. The contrast was almost unbearable. Whispers moved through the palace. Some wondered why fate had singled out Umberto, and not his elder brother, the heir. Others said it was precisely because he was the shadow, the overlooked one, that history allowed him to slip away unnoticed. But among the family, such speculation brought no comfort. A mother grieves not for politics, but for the child she has lost. A father mourns not as a king, but as a man who has buried his son. In the weeks that followed, the court attempted to preserve dignity in mourning. Official announcements praised his service, his humility, his willingness to share in the soldiers' hardships. Yet even in these words, there was an undertone of fragility. The speeches were brief, the ceremonies muted. Italy was weary of death, weary of mourning. The people themselves had little space left to grieve for a prince when their own families were burying sons by the hundreds. And so, the grief of the Savoy house became private, folded inward. The dynasty that had stood as a symbol of unity found itself diminished by the same plague that tore through villages and cities. For Victor Emmanuel, the loss of Umberto was a reminder that kingship could not bargain with fate. For Elena, it was the cruel proof that motherhood could not shield her children from the world's indifference. Perhaps the sharpest pain of all was this: Umberto left behind no legacy to anchor his memory, no children to carry his name, no political career to preserve his words, no heroic tale to inscribe his face into history. His death was not an end that echoed. It was an end that dissolved, like a candle extinguished in a room already filled with shadows. And yet, for the House of Savoy, those shadows remained. They lingered in the corridors, whispered in the halls, haunted the silence of family dinners. The war might end, empires might fall, but the absence of a son remained unhealed. In that absence lay the true tragedy of Umberto's life: that he had been overlooked in birth, overlooked in life, and most painfully, overlooked in death. History is not kind to those who leave quietly. Its gaze lingers on conquerors, reformers, and martyrs. But it seldom bends down to gather the faint traces of lives cut short without spectacle. In the flood of events that closed the Great War, Prince Umberto's death became a detail, a line in a telegram, an entry in an obituary. He did not fall in battle at the head of a regiment, nor was he assassinated in some political intrigue. He died of influenza, a phrase so common in 1918 that it carried almost no weight at all. The world had no time to pause. Newspapers printed his name briefly, then turned the page to report on the crumbling of empires and the approaching armistice. Soldiers returned home to find their villages half emptied by the flu, their families grieving brothers and fathers. In such an ocean of loss, one prince's death was a drop, noticed, then lost in the current. Even in his own country, his passing did not spark monuments or national mourning. Italy itself was exhausted, broken by war and drained by epidemic. There is a bitter irony in this forgetting. A royal life, raised within palaces, groomed with military discipline, meant to carry some fragment of dynastic dignity, reduced to a footnote. In archives, his story is preserved mostly in lists. Born 1889, died 1918. Occasionally, a photograph surfaces. Umberto standing stiff in uniform, his eyes serious, his mouth set in a line. Yet the image carries no legend. He is just one more young man swallowed by the war's silence. The tragedy is not only personal, but symbolic. His obscurity reflects the very nature of the pandemic itself. Indiscriminate, relentless, erasing not just lives, but identities. The Spanish flu did not make heroes, it made corpses. It flattened the grand and the humble alike, leaving behind no glory, only statistics. In Umberto's case, the anonymity was amplified. Already the spare, overshadowed by an elder brother destined for the throne, he now became the prince history forgot to remember. And yet, in that forgetting, a deeper truth emerges. Umberto's fate illustrates the equalizing cruelty of both war and plague. He was proof that death respected no hierarchy, that privilege could not protect against the weight of mortality. His erasure is, paradoxically, his legacy. By vanishing into silence, he stands as a reminder of all those who vanished with him. Millions of names left unspoken, millions of lives reduced to statistics. If history is a tapestry, Umberto's thread was short and faint, but it was woven in the same fabric as countless others. His life may not have shaped nations, but his death symbolized the condition of his age. Fragility amid grandeur, mortality amid ambition. To look at his story is to glimpse the larger story of a world undone by forces it could not control. What remains of him today? A grave, scarcely visited. A line in genealogies of the House of Savoy. A faint memory among specialists of the Great War. Nothing more. But perhaps that nothing more is itself the point. For Umberto's life, lived in shadow and ended in silence, reflects the vast majority of human existence, the kind not immortalized in monuments, but dissolved into the quiet dust of time. History forgot him, but in forgetting, it revealed the truth he carried in death. That titles fade, dynasties crumble, and memory itself is as fragile as breath. What remains when a life leaves little trace? For Prince Umberto of Savoy, the answer is not carved in monuments or preserved in memoirs. His legacy is as fragile as breath in cold air, visible for a moment, then gone. And yet, it is precisely this fragility that gives his story its meaning. He left behind no heirs, no political influence, no reforms attached to his name. Unlike his brother, he would never ascend a throne. Unlike generals, he would never be remembered for victories or defeats. The only inheritance he offered to history was his humanity, revealed most clearly in the way he died. Not above his soldiers, but among them. Not with grandeur, but with ordinariness. His death reminds us that history is not only the tale of crowns and treaties, but also of bodies laid low by forces beyond control. In 1918, millions fell to an invisible enemy, and Umberto's inclusion among them demonstrates a profound truth. Mortality dissolves privilege. The same fever that entered the lungs of peasants entered his. The same cough that bent soldiers doubled him over. The equality of suffering became the harshest democracy of all. There is an image worth holding. A young man of noble blood, sitting in a trench beside ordinary soldiers, listening more than speaking. That image is his real monument. It embodies a humility rare in courts and a solidarity rare in war. If his life was overshadowed, then perhaps his quiet willingness to share the burdens of common men was his truest act of distinction. The fragility of his memory also carries a warning. How many lives, royal or humble, vanish in silence? How many names are lost because their deaths did not fit the narratives of power or triumph? Umberto stands as a symbol of that vast forgetting. To remember him is to remember all those whose lives were consumed by plague, by war, by indifference. His shadow stretches beyond his own story into the countless shadows of his generation. And yet, there is dignity in that. To be forgotten alongside millions is not failure. It is testimony to the common bond of mortality. His life, brief and muted, reminds us that the worth of existence does not depend on grandeur. Even in obscurity, even in anonymity, there is meaning. The House of Savoy continued, its history moving toward both triumph and collapse. But within its lineage, the name Umberto Maria Vittorio Amedeo Giuseppe di Savoia lingers faintly, like a note in a song half heard. He did not shape nations, but his life holds a quiet lesson for our own. That titles are fragile, victories fleeting, and memory as delicate as glass. Perhaps the true measure of his legacy is not found in archives, but in reflection. To think of him is to confront the uncomfortable truth that we too may be forgotten, that our names may not endure, but our humanity, the kindness we show, the burdens we share, remains the only inheritance worth leaving. Prince Umberto's life ended at 29, erased by fever. But in that erasure lies a mirror. It asks us to see ourselves not as heirs of crowns or pawns of history, but as human beings bound together in fragility. His story, almost lost, becomes a reminder. In the face of death, what endures is not power, but compassion. And so, his legacy, fragile though it is, survives in the lesson it whispers. A prince can die like a soldier. A life can vanish like smoke. But the dignity of sharing suffering, of walking among others without privilege, remains a monument no epidemic can erase.